For you, who has never forgotten the magic. It wants you to know it remembers you too. Today is the start of me catching up on all of the book talks that I have to do before I can read any more poetry books. Hey everybody, what is up? It's so great to be back. Thank you for watching and welcome back to my channel. I'm Anna, and today I have a really great poetry book for you guys. And this is definitely one that I wanted to do before I do any of the new poetry that I have. One of the main reasons that I haven't been filming a lot of videos is because there is one in particular that I'm doing today that I really wanted to do before I did anything else. And it has been so intimidating because this book is literally just kind of a masterpiece in my opinion. I just want to say before I start, there is so much to this book that if I was to talk about every single thing, I could literally make this video an hour long. But I don't want to do that, partly because I don't have a full hour to record, but second of all, I don't want to spoil everything for you. There are so many great things about this book that I think are just better discovered on your own, through your own lens, through your own sort of point of view of the world. And so I just want to give sort of my quick feedback on it and highly recommend it to you guys, even before I tell you what it is, because truly it's an amazing book. So without further ado, let's get into it. So the book that I have for you guys today is Fierce Fairytales by Nikita Gill. I remember when I started this book and I was posting on Instagram like, oh, I can't wait to read it, like having no idea that it was gonna like change my mind on fairy tales. Not really change my mind on fairy tales, but definitely it definitely opens my mind to like the millions of possibilities that fairy tales can have. And this just sort of blows the box away for fairy tales. And Nikita just basically makes it something that can be so wholesome and for everyone. And I don't know, I really love it. And I don't even know like how to say it. I don't have the words, but I'm gonna try it for you guys because I really want you guys to read this. So there aren't any sections in this book. She just sort of goes through it in one go, no breaks, you just one after the other, which is fine. And the way that she does it is she weaves even more than fairy tales. She goes past fairy tales. So she definitely has the traditional fairy tale like Cinderella, Snow White, Little Red Riding Hood, but she also brings myths and legends and male perspective and villains into it and so much more, to the point where it feels like she's addressed every aspect of a fairy tale and then gone beyond that. She has repurposed some, she has retold some in a better way as far as I'm concerned. She's definitely changed a lot of the perspectives, or in the poems where she's not seeking to change the perspective of the characters, she's definitely seeking to change your perspective as the reader for why you should not like or like even more a specific character. And that's something that I really appreciate. I love when my point of view has been sort of flipped on its head in a way that makes me see a character in a different light. I like that especially with villains, because villains are often sort of, I guess, stereotyped as like always evil and only evil, when in reality that's definitely not the case for actual people. People are very complex, very layered, interwoven. They have backstory, they have reasons for doing things, they have things that happen in the past that create the person that they are today. And so I feel like if you take a villain, or any character, but specifically a villain, if you take a villain and just look at them for whatever time frame the story is in, you sort of get this very two-dimensional character. And so what Nikita does is she adds in all of those elements, and you have a greater appreciation not only for the character and their impact, but definitely more love for the story itself. And it also makes you, it makes you responsible as a reader, because you can't there are some actions or feelings that you have towards a character that you have to take responsibility for in light of other facts that have now been presented to you. And it sort of makes it hard to justify hating a specific character because there's more to them than just the actions that they do. It's definitely a lot more about motive and backstory. One of the best ones as well was called The Shoemaker's Son. And this is where she gives backstory to Jafar's story, Jafar from Aladdin, and I really loved it. Like, there's so many things in this book that just blew me away, and of course people generally don't like Jafar. He's portrayed as like this old miserable creep who is power hungry and will do anything in his power to ensure that his position is secure. As far as murder, even, he was really willing to go the ultimate way, and she gives a really interesting point of view that I think a lot of people will, even if they don't like it, they will definitely understand him better. Anyways, that's me rambling on about like storytelling. I just want to say this is definitely a longer poetry book, so I would definitely rate this, if I had to rate it, I guess beginner, like intermediate, advanced, expert. This would definitely be an intermediate to advanced level of poetry to book. Not because of the wording or like like a lot of them do take up the whole page. A lot of it is heavy content in the sense of like you have to think about it, you have to think through it a lot. But the nice thing is a lot of these stories we've all heard before. So what she's doing is she's not necessarily introducing new stories, she's just changing the way that we see them, which I really appreciate. That being said, there are a couple new stories that I wasn't sure about, I've never heard of, and that was also great to discover new stories. One more thing about villains. So when she's writing about them, clearly a lot of people, or most people, do know what the villain is known for. She writes about Jafar, she writes about the wicked stepmother in Cinderella, she writes about the wicked queen in Snow White. But what she's doing is she's not excusing their actions. Like, we all know that their actions are horrible. But what she's doing is she's adding context so that we can't just blindly judge them, which I think is sort of a commentary. It may be, I don't know if this was intentional when she was writing this, but it's definitely a commentary on how we, in this modern day society, judge people blindly. We just take their actions and we don't look any deeper. It can oftentimes have damaging effects on those people's lives. Not to excuse what they did, but what happens is it makes it very hard for them to come back from that, to change. If they mean to change for the better, it makes it very hard for them to rehabilitate, if that makes sense, back into society. And so it's always really important in storytelling, in real life, to analyze situations with as many facts as possible. I think one of the things that I was really nervous about in reviewing this book is because there aren't any sections, which I don't mind in reading, but in reviewing it makes it a little bit harder because she does have like direction, but it's sort of hard to pin down like where she moves from. I will say she does start with a lot of sort of traditional stories that we do know. She starts in the beginning, so with the universe, kind of what I like to think of as like the creation of the fictional fairy tale universe, and how that came into being, and how it's actually really closely linked to ideas of how our own universe came into being, whether you believe in a higher power creating the universe, or science, or just sort of a combination of both. She does add that element in, and it sort of links it to how the world of storytelling, the world of fairy tale, the world of imagination came into being. One of my favorite poems from that section, that sort of beginning section, is called Somewhere Across the Universe, This Intergalactic Fairy Tale is Being Told. And this was like the moment that I knew that this book was going to be amazing, because I've actually somehow never considered this possibility. So it's essentially about another being in another place in the universe, in the galaxy, in the cosmos, telling a fairy story about us, humans who live on Earth. And it's just such an interesting point of view as like a being who is outside of our world, who maybe has experienced us in some way, but they're not of us, they're not us. And they're telling someone our story in the context, or in the theme of a fairy tale. And like, we are the myth, we are the legend for some little alien child or whatever. And I just love that. I just thought that's, I don't know, like, I would love to see like an animated version of that, of someone who is so far removed from us looking at us and taking our stories or making stories about us to their like little ones, and those are what they would have grown up on, stories about us. That, I don't know, something about that like warms me. Anyways, then she goes into really interesting concepts about the way that we tell stories, you know, in the past, and how it relates to right now. There's this one poem called The Woods Incarnate, and it sort of, it definitely links the past to the present, in that her first line is, "We traded the woods for high rises, and the wolf became the boy next door." So I guess setting in that sense changes because we modernize. We don't live, at least not a lot of people in the first world, we don't live in woods anymore. We don't have that relationship with land anymore. But what we do have is the city. And that has become the new setting for the woods. And so those are the places where we have to be careful now. Of course, this was the story, of course, with Little Red Riding Hood, and how she went into the woods and the wolf was the villain. The wolf was who she had to look out for. But now, the wolf now becomes the boy next door, the person who we're not assuming is going to be dangerous. And so it sort of is like, oh, this is the street smarts. John Mulaney, if anyone loves John Mulaney. But she actually does use that phrase, street smart, for survival. Like, our survival has changed from being aware of someone who is so very obviously bad to someone who is it's very hard to tell sometimes. Another really, really good one that I loved was called Boy Lost, which was about Peter Pan. And I'm not going to spoil it, because that one, I think the first time you read that, it really moves you, and so I don't want to take away from that feeling, because I think that's super important. But she's very good at taking concept and expanding it and really bringing it to life in a way that links to the story incredibly well. She talks about Peter Pan, about Wendy, about children, and how children's minds work. But more than just how they work, more like how they are formed. They are formed by their environment. They are formed by their influences, either their parents, their caregivers. They're formed by the things that they see in life, the feelings that they experience, the trauma that they go through, if and hopefully never when they go through that trauma. But she definitely doesn't ignore the fact that they do, and the fact that those bad experiences that they have really do shape who they become earlier on. And I feel like the way that children are viewed just in general is that they're not really like people. Like, they're important and they should be protected, but they're not like really people until they can voice their opinions, if that makes sense. And even though children are capable of doing that from a very young age, I think once it becomes sort of like an in-your-face type of thing, that's when we start taking them seriously. And the problem with that is we've sort of ignored their progression up until that point, and then they become a problem, or they start questioning things, and then all of a sudden we're like, oh, you're big now. And it's like, no, that little person has been a person with feelings and opinions and questions all this time, and they have changed and become this person because of all of those things that happened when they were little, and I love that she addresses that. If anybody has seen that new Cinderella movie with Lily James, Richard Madden, I think his name is, and Kate Blanchett, amazing. That retelling of Cinderella is what is actually my favorite ever version of Cinderella. I was never really into Cinderella or cared about Cinderella up until that version, and and Nikita really does. I feel like her take on the stepmother was sort of an expansion of what they were portraying in that movie, of how the stepmother wasn't always like that. No one is born like that usually. The stepmother was such a clear case of circumstance and who she had to become based on her circumstance. And I just love that the reason Nikita Gill gives for the stepmother being cruel to Cinderella doesn't excuse her cruelty, but it does give you insight into why. And that always just makes a difference. It really does. She really does, obviously bolster femininity, feminism in this book, because oftentimes the way that fairy tales are portrayed, it's the women who are weak and the men who are strong. And even though the story is about the woman, it always seems to be the man that comes along and makes her life better. And there are certain instances, of course, where that is acceptable, but I think across the board that has been a trope in most fairy tales that are told to children. And so Nikita takes that and she's like, well, there's a different way that we could see this. He also retells a couple of stories in light of that mindset, and it really does change how the story goes, and I like it better, and I think it's a little more accurate for our times. Okay, so there is a story that is addressed in this collection of poetry that I've actually read a book about, but it's not a really well-known fairy tale, at least not in America. It could be elsewhere, but the book that I'm thinking of is called The Rose and the Dagger, and I think it's by this author named Renée. I forget her last name, and I'll put it down in the description. But that story is about a woman who lives in a very sort of scary time period where the king would take a wife every night, and in the morning he would kill her. And nobody knew why, but everybody just hated him for it. And so one day she becomes the queen. She marries this king, and she's the only one to survive because of her storytelling ability. She manages to tell him a story so well that it pulls him in and makes him not kill her but keep her alive so he can hear more of the story. And of course there's more to it than that, and there's a lot of details interwoven, but that is sort of the beginning of the story. And I saw that story in this collection. I was like, wait, I know this story. I literally wrote it in there. That I was so excited that I found one that wasn't well known that I did know. And I just love when that happens. Towards the end of the book, she starts to link everything that she has discussed in this book. She starts to relate it to the individual, to the woman who may be reading this, or the girl who may be reading this. And she starts to incorporate lessons into the poetry about how to perceive oneself in light of everyone else, but also how to sort of self-reflect on who you are as a person. And so I thought that was just a really great way to end it, because all of these fairy stories serve or exist for one reason, and that is to connect us better to the world that we live in, to the people that we love or people that we may not love, to ourselves, if you're religious, to a god, if you're scientific, to the universe. Those are what the stories seek to do. And so I love that she takes all of the things that she says and then moves it towards the individual. And so there's one that I loved that was called Question the Fairy Tale. She has this really great question, and she goes, what if Fairy tales aren't as innocent as they sound, and even princesses aren't perfect. What if I told you that your damage doesn't define you, and the way you survived is no one else's damned business? Now, that's really profound because a lot of the time we do see those princesses as perfect, and we do see fairy tales as innocent for us to tell children, because we do equate children with innocence. Yeah, it's a really good question, and actually, I realize that this video is going to actually literally be 30 minutes long, but I think it's really important. There's an article by J.R.R. Tolkien, who is literally the king of fairy tale, if anyone's read Lord of the Rings, where he says that fairy tales are not actually for children, or they shouldn't be solely for children. They are really for us, for adults, to see our world in a different way and to connect with our world in a different way. And that's the importance of imagination. And so he's like, they're not innocent tales. They're actually sometimes really R-rated, and that's okay because our world is actually really R-rated. And so if it's going to reflect our world in any way, it's not always going to be pretty. It's not always going to be perfect. The princess is not always going to have it together, and the prince is not always going to be the one to save the day. And I think that is a great, it's a great chain breaker for fairy tales, where I feel like fairy tales have been always this sort of boxed in type of genre, where in fact it could be anything. It really doesn't have to be boxes that you tick off with, like damsel in distress, prince saves the day, dragon is bad and dies. You know, it doesn't, it's definitely not supposed to be that cut and dry. Aptly, her last poem is entitled Happily Ever After, and I really do feel like she ends it in a very happy, hopeful manner and dedicates it to all of the women and people in her life who have helped her reach the point where she could write this. So that is my very long-winded but genuine, heartfelt feelings towards this book. I 12 out of 10 recommend this for anyone who loves fairy tales, fairy stories, for anyone who wants a different take on the old ways that we view fairy tales, and just even if you don't love fairy tales, I guarantee you this will make you reevaluate the way that you think about stories in general. So thank you so much for watching, guys. I'm so happy to be able to talk about the stuff that I'm really passionate about here, and I'm so happy that you guys are watching and commenting and creating a really small, so far, really small, but I really love hearing from you guys, a really small community that I cherish with my whole heart, and that I hope will grow as time goes by. If you know anyone that loves poetry, that loves storytelling, that just, I don't know, just loves what I love, then please tell them about this channel and have a comment below letting me know what you thought. Yeah, so I will see you guys in the next video, and have a great day.